Hello, this is Daryl Ehrlich with the Billings Gazette, and this is Vietnam Voices, a project of the Billings Gazette sponsored by Master Lube. And today we are on location. This is the first time we've moved out of studio, but today we've come up north to talk with Rod Knutson. He is a Billings native. He's got an amazing story, and I'm really happy to share it. Thank you, Rod, for agreeing to. We're in his home, so thank you for welcoming us in. Thank you for being for agreeing to share your story with us. We really appreciate that.
Thanks.
So let's start in the beginning. You were with both your career military. You were with both the Marine Corps and the Navy. Let's talk about. What was happening before 1957 when you were still in Billings? Let's talk about life before the military. What were you doing? Where were you at?
I was born and raised in Billings. My mother and her family had lived there for many years. My grandfather was a constable in Billings. That's a picture of him above my head there. That's the old Billings Brewery.
Yep, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous.
Yeah. And I have a brother and a sister. All three of us were born and raised in Billings and graduated from Billings Senior High School. Okay. I graduated from high school in 1956.
Okay, so you graduated and then what?
I went to college at Eastern for 2 quarters. I wasn't dedicated, I wasn't interested. And my buddies had kind of gone in the service, and so I decided I wanted to do that rather than just flunk out of college.
Right.
And so I joined the Marine Corps.
Okay, why any particular affinity for the Marine Corps, or why Marines?
No, my family had mostly been in the Navy. Okay. Some people had been in the Army in World War II, but my buddies in high school had kind of joined the Marine Corps, so that's where I headed.
Okay, so Marine Corps, and what did you do in the Marine Corps? Where was basic, and what were you trained to do in the Marine Corps?
I was just a regular infantryman. I went to boot camp at San Diego at MCRD, trained at Camp Pendleton, and then just spent my time as a infantryman. Came back to Billings in the 58th Infantry Company Marine Reserve Unit, and I stayed in that reserve unit after I got out of the Marine Corps, after I got off of active duty and went back to college again.
Okay, so where'd you go back to college?
Eastern Montana College, which is now Montana State at Eastern.
Yeah. Were you a little more serious of a student after the Marine Corps?
Very much so, and I did fine.
Yeah. So what made you decide? Now let's talk about Navy. You decided to rejoin. Is that correct? Join the Navy and go on careerist, or how did that happen?
My last year in college, my best friend had a brother that was a Navy pilot. Okay. And that brother came to Billings on a recruiting trip. And he talked to, Tom Knob was my best friend. Tom Knob and I talked us into flying out to Seattle to take the physical. I had always been interested in flying. So Tom and I flew to Seattle. We both passed the physical and decided to join the Navy. So I originally thought I would try to stay in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps would not guarantee me pilot training, but the Navy would.
Okay. Had you had any interest in aviation or pilot or anything like that before, or was that even on your horizon, so to speak?
Not really, other than just pipe dreams.
Okay.
I can remember going to an air show in Billings one time and thinking how great it would be to fly, but I had never done anything as far as getting flying lessons or anything. So
you'd never really been in a plane as a amateur, or you hadn't had a pilot's license or anything like that?
That's correct.
Okay.
I had not.
So what's pilot training like, and when you sign up to do that, let's walk through that a little bit. What's that like? What are you trained on? How does that work?
It's rigorous training in that I had a class, I can't remember the numbers, so these may not be accurate, but for example, we started out with something like 70 some guys, and the guys that actually graduated were down in the 40s and 50s somewhere. So there's a big attrition rate. Part of the initial training is just like boot camp. It's physical, it's classroom, it's military tradition, and then when you finish that and get your commission, you're commissioned as an ensign, and then you actually go start the physical flight training part. When I graduated from pre-flight, got my commission, and went out to flight training, when I took the physical, I flunked the eye test.
Wow, okay.
So we'd had a heavy weekend after we graduated.
Okay.
I blamed it on that, but I was not allowed to retake the physical.
Okay.
So I had a choice, and what I chose was to go to the Navy Flight Officer program, which is a non-pilot program, and I graduated from that training in August of '63, and went from there, ended up in fighters, flying the back seat of the F-4 Phantom.
Okay. And was that still enjoyable? I mean, even though that you didn't go that route, you went kind of a slightly different route. You still got you in the airplane.
Yes, I was doing the kinds of things that I wanted to do, flying the kind of airplane that I wanted to fly, but I was not the pilot. The thing that kept driving me was, after you serve at least a year in a fleet squadron, then you can take the physical again, and I was sure I'd be able to pass the physical once I took it the second time.
And you took it a second time?
I got shot down in between, so the second time that I took it was about 8 years later.
Okay. Let's talk about 19. So you're with a flight squadron. Let's back up a little. Let's talk about your where you were assigned and what you were doing from the second seat of a fighter pilot.
The mission of the back seat in an F-4 Phantom in the Navy is you are called a radar intercept officer.
Okay.
Sometimes called an RIO. And your mission is to operate the radar system, the combat system for shooting missiles, assisting the pilot in navigation, talking on the radios, and a sundry of other things. You are an integral part of the crew. You brief and fly and debrief as a crew together. The way the Navy does it is you normally fly with the same pilot almost all of the time. And I was assigned to a Navy fighter squadron, VF-84, the Jolly Rogers. We were embarked on the carrier USS Independence. And when I first arrived at the squadron, we were doing hot pad duty in Key West, Florida, which was flying the barrier between Cuba and the United States. Just a protective barrier. Fighters were launched to intercept any MiGs coming out of Cuba at the time. And then we started workups for our deployment. And so we made a couple of short cruises down into the Caribbean. As it came close to deployment time, we were supposed to go to the Mediterranean. That got changed, and we went around the Horn and went to Vietnam instead.
Now, when you were in, let's talk about like kind of early 60s up to 63, 64. More of our concern was really with Cuba and Russia. And did you think you were going to be more Cold War on that side of the world than going to somewhere like Southeast Asia? Or what was your awareness of what was going on in Vietnam?
Vietnam was just cranking up, and we assumed that we would fly combat missions. It was a little bit ill-defined. However, en route there, we found that very definitely we would be flying combat missions in South Vietnam.
Did you know a lot about, I mean, I know that a lot of the people, if you would have talked to in 63, 64, would have been may not have known where Vietnam was. Did you know where Vietnam was? Were you aware of the situation?
I did. We had a lot of intelligence briefings prior to going over, and then the whole transit over there, which takes pretty close to 3 weeks. We had daily intelligence briefings, so I was pretty up to speed by the time we got there.
Does a guy in a fighter plane worry about, am I going to make it back? Because I mean, the mission is inherently dangerous.
I didn't think about that an awful lot. Yes, that's always there. Flying off of a carrier, you always think about it anyway. I felt that, there was always that possibility, but it was an exciting job. I mean, it was kind of a life out of the movies type of job.
Yeah. What was the most exciting? What was the most enjoyable part of that of that job? Let's talk about that.
Well, it's a finite group of people. There are not very many people get to do it, and you're very carefully trained, and you have to maintain a certain skill level, or you just can't do it. And so kind of the excitement was the image. I remember seeing a movie one time of I can't think of his name right now, but he was in his choker whites, and he was a naval aviator, and now I was that, I guess.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So it did live up to the image? I mean, the life lived up to the image.
Oh yes, and it was exciting. I thought it was fun. It was challenging, and it was hard work too.
Yeah. What do you have to do to keep? I mean, how often do you fly, and what's the physical regimen just to be able to do that and to keep up?
In the Navy, when you're on the ship, you have to maintain currency. Flying, well, we normally fly 2 hops a day, which means 2 landings a day on the ship. And you have to have a night landing every 3 days. So there was a lot of flying.
Yeah, but that's enjoyable if that's what you like.
Oh, it is.
Let's talk about landing on carriers, because there's been a lot of movies made about that, but that's inherently pretty dangerous too, because you've got to take off and land almost perfectly all the time. There's not a lot of room for error, I imagine. What's that like? What's the challenging part of it? Walk us through that.
The catapult shot is like an e-ride at Disneyland.
Okay.
The way it works in a Phantom is you taxi the airplane, you man the airplane back by the island of the carrier, and then you taxi the airplane from there to one of 4 catapults on the ship. And as you taxi up to the catapult, there's an airplane director that taxis you precisely so the wheel goes over the chuck of the catapult, and you stop the airplane. They put a bridle on it that hooks onto 2 hooks, and then the center of the bridle hooks over the catapult. You run the engines up, make sure you've got power. You cycle controls around. There's checkers that check to make sure your elevators and ailerons are working properly. And then you salute the catapult officer. He kneels down and touches the deck, and off to the side, a catapult shooter slaps a button, plunger, and it fires. A Phantom fully loaded is about 80,000 pounds.
Wow.
So that's 40 tons. And it accelerates from 0 to 175 miles an hour in 2 seconds.
Wow.
And that's about 100 feet.
Wow. And what that must be kind of a thrill.
It is. You're just along for the ride.
Right.
You really cannot do anything until you feel the release of the catapult, and then the airplane is already at flying speed and flying itself, and you start controlling it.
Right. Is it terrifying? I mean, if something goes, you're just along for the ride, and
No, to me it was not terrifying. In fact, I think I enjoyed every cat shot that I had. The way you feel when the cat goes, your body does this.
right. Wow.
That's the way it feels for the cat shot.
And then you're going. Then you're off. And what about landing? Now we've talked about the cat shot. The landing is equally kind of challenging, right? Because you have to be dead center and right.
Yes, there's 11 feet of clearance between the tip of the hook and the tail end of the aircraft carrier.
Okay.
So you're trying to get through, we call it an 11 to a 22-foot window.
Okay.
And you're going 170 miles an hour. You subtract about 30 from that because the ship is going that fast.
Right.
There are two distinctly different kinds of cat shots, two distinctly different kinds of carrier landings. One occurs in the daytime, one occurs at night.
Okay, tell me about that.
In a cat shot at night is you go through this down the cat
Right.
into blackness. It's just pure black. In the middle of the ocean at night with no moon, it's black. You can't see the horizon out there. There are no other lights out there in front of you. So you're solely flying the airplane off of instruments.
Wow.
On a arrested landing, you have a visual cue that you fly. There's a set of horizontal green lights on the left back side of the ship. And then there's a vertical set of lenses, and I think there are 7 of them. And there is a light that shines on those lenses that is angled into the lens so that you have a 2.5 to a 5 degree glide slope to fly down to the ship. The way the pilot in the cockpit tells that he's on that glide slope is when you look at those green datum lights, there is a single one of those lenses that is lit up, and that is orange, and we call it the meatball.
Okay.
And when that meatball is lined up in between the orange or the green datum lights, that means you're on glide slope. So it's the pilot's job that if that orange meatball starts to climb or descend, to correct the airplane to ensure that you stay on glide slope.
Right. So is it nerve-wracking when you can't see anything and you're at night and you've got to totally trust what your instruments are telling you?
That's correct. At night, you fly. It's like an instrument approach. You have people on the ship that are in the Combat Information Center. They're watching you on radar. They're giving you guidance as far as headings and altitudes to fly to get you onto that glide slope. And then at 3/4 of a mile, they want you to take over visually looking at the meatball.
Okay.
And so they'll fly you into that window with you making corrections that they're giving you to get into that window. Of course, meanwhile, you also have to maintain the speed of the airplane, the attitude of the airplane, get your flaps down and your gear down and the hook down.
It's busy.
It's busy.
What's the is landing that I think everybody's probably seen it from movies, and the landing and the hook, is that, I mean, that's a pretty narrow window. Is that hard to do? I mean, how do you, is it just a lot of practice? Tell me about that.
I think the hardest thing that I've ever done is land on a carrier at night. I should clarify, when I was in Vietnam, I was an RIO. I was in the back seat.
Yep.
When I came back home afterwards, I went to pilot training and I became a pilot. I flew the Phantom and I flew it from the front seat, and I had a number of carrier landings as a pilot. So what I'm describing to you is
after.
the pilot's view, which I was later on. The pilot in the airplane has 2 throttles in his left hand.
Okay.
And each one of them operates independently. And normally you keep them locked together in your hand like this. The stick sits down here between your legs. The finite movements that you're making during a carrier landing is your hands on the throttles are constantly going like this.
Okay.
Very seldom do you leave it in one position very long. And your hand on the stick is going like this all the time, because there's turbulence, there's air movement out there. The airplane is a very unstable platform, and it's not inherently stable coming in for a landing.
Right.
Plus you're going 150 miles an hour. Right as you approach the back end of the carrier is going through the water at roughly 30 miles an hour. So the wind is coming over the deck, and as you're landing, all of that tumbling over the aft end of the ship catches the airplane just about a second or so before you're going to touch down. So you're trying to combat that turbulence as well. Once you land on the carrier, you go full throttle and keep your stick forward while you're touching the deck. If you happen to miss a wire or the wire breaks or something, you're already at full power, and then you just ease the stick back to fly off again.
Right. So it's your safety insurance. Because if you slow down and you don't have the throttle, you'll go on the drink.
And when you catch the wire, you're at full throttle. You've got the stick stabilized. Your harness is locked, but it's still, you go like this until it stops.
Right.
And it only stops in maybe 2 or 3 seconds.
Right. So you go down. You stop quickly. You start quickly and you stop quickly.
You do.
What's the so when you're let's talk about so you're reassigned to Vietnam instead of going to the Mediterranean. You're reassigned to Vietnam. When you get there, what's it like as far as what do you notice about the mission, the sorties that you're flying, and then what's a typical mission or training like when you're over there?
Each squadron has its own ready room.
Okay.
And that's where you prepare for your flight. And associated to that ready room is a little locker room area, and that's where all your flight gear is, and you keep your helmet and all that. Your briefings are done in a different part of the ship. And the air in the ready room was one of excitement.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that we felt as pilots and air crew was we had spent lots and lots of time training. Mm-hmm. And this was the real thing. And we were excited about it. I can't say that 100% of the pilots were excited about it, You know, an apple barrel's got all kinds of different apples in it.
Yep.
But by and large, everybody was excited and happy about flying the missions, and there wasn't any problem at all. I mean, we just...
Because you trained, this is what you wanted.
Yep.
This is where you want to be.
There was exuberance, and as you flew a mission, it's kind of like being on a target range. Right. You know, to get a bullseye is, good deal.
Right.
Well, the same thing when you're on a mission, and if your mission happens to be bombing a truck convoy, and you get bombs on target, then it was, yay!
Yeah.
You know?
So now an F4 is it running bombs? Is it running interference missions to try to destroy those convoys and do that? Is that what your squadron was routinely doing, or what? Give me an idea of what you were.
Okay, in the 60s, the aircraft carrier had a reconnaissance squadron.
Okay.
2 attack squadrons, which were bomber squadrons.
Okay.
And 2 fighter squadrons, which were primary mission was fighter.
Okay.
In South Vietnam, there weren't any air-to-air threats that we knew of, and so we converted the F-4 fighters into a sort of a bomber.
Okay.
Sometimes we dropped bombs, but usually we armed the wing racks, which you would carry missiles on. We armed those wing racks with rockets.
Okay.
We put Lao 19 rockets on there, or sometimes we carried napalm on them.
Okay.
So if your mission was a bombing mission, you had either rockets or bombs. If your mission was purely air-to-air, it was called CAP, which is Combat Air Patrol. And once we started flying in the northern area and North Vietnam, then most of our missions were CAP. Some of them were CAP and flak suppression, which meant in a flak suppression mission, you carried rockets as well.
Okay. So you were running those. So were you ever engaging? I know the North Vietnamese had. They had MiGs that were Russian made. Were you concerned about those threats routinely, or what was your perception of that?
We were. We spent our first line period, which was about a month, in South Vietnam flying missions in South Vietnam. Then we went into the Philippines for some R&R. We went back out on the line, and this time we flew just a few missions in the south and then moved up to the north, and all the rest of our missions were in North Vietnam. By and large, they were missions of road recce, which is flying along the roads finding targets of opportunity, or they were missions on bridges or missions on POL, which was petroleum oil depots. And the kinds of missions that I flew most of the time were either combat air patrol in escort of the bombers or combat air patrol combined with flak suppression.
Okay, so flak suppression is you're going in there and you're trying to take out any anti-aircraft guns, correct?
Correct.
From the ground, surface to air guns. Okay, so what's the so when you first get over there, what's your impression of Vietnam? What did you think of just the land, flying over? How does a guy in a F4 view Vietnam at the time?
I think the thing that probably hit me the most was it was such a detached thing. We could hear all the radio calls. We flew many support missions in South Vietnam where a forward air controller would call us in on targets. He would tell us where the friendly troops were, where the target was. in the cockpit, when you flew those missions, you're kind of detached from it. You don't feel or hear the thunderous explosions, the havoc that you're creating on the ground. You always are worried about dropping on friendlies or interfering with friendlies, but by and large, you don't feel what the troops on the ground are feeling.
Right.
There was one point that I had an airplane that was shot up. We landed at Da Nang, had to stay overnight while they patched up the airplane well enough to get it back to the ship. And we stayed with the Marines in a hooch, which was a Quonset hut. And we got some taste of what they were living. I mean, it was totally, completely, 1,000% different than what we were living.
Wow. Wow. When you were over there, what did you miss? What did you miss about home?
The first thing that popped into my head when you asked that question was, on an aircraft carrier, you run out of fresh food and milk.
Okay.
And the first thing that popped into my head was milk.
You know what? You're not the first who said that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
But you miss mail. You don't get mail as often.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat difficult to get along without.
I'll pause it for just a second. Get your mic. So you missed milk, you missed mail, you didn't get mail. It must have been hard too, because Montana doesn't have a lot of aircraft carriers and oceans and tropical. I mean, I'm guessing Vietnam looks nothing like Montana.
No, it was a different environment to get used to living on the ship. One of the things that I enjoyed on the ship was, on an aircraft carrier, you're inside all the time that you're on the ship. Very seldom are you ever outside, because the outside is an airfield.
Right.
So every evening that I was free and I could do this, I used to like to go up and watch the sunset. And for my whole Navy career, that kind of became a thing, to watch the sunset.
Yeah. Is it part of, you've got a beautiful home here. Can you watch the sunset out here?
Because the mountains are in the way,
Yeah.
we don't see it very well, but yes, I do.
Okay. Let's talk about, so there are several times you've got pictures. Let's talk about, you had a plane that you had to land in Da Nang. Was that the one that had a hole through the wing, shot through the wing, or was that different?
No, that was a different one.
Let's talk about what's it like. I mean, you're not just flying the friendly skies, you're flying some very unfriendly skies. What is it like taking some of the enemy fire and getting shot at? That must be terrifying and very stressful.
It's not like the movies. You don't hear this.
Okay.
And because we maintained radio silence while we were flying, you're not talking to other people. Only occasionally would somebody say something over the radio, and it was normally if a SAM was shot at you, a surface-to-air missile, and you felt that somebody had not seen it.
Okay.
So normally it's very quiet. There isn't a lot of chatter on the radios. You see the flak, and it's just kind of little clouds that puff out there in the sky. You don't hear that. If it gets close to you, you might feel the shock of it. And yes, it's kind of scary. But I don't know, your adrenaline is pumping so much. I have to say, down someplace inside, I was probably scared, But I didn't feel that while I was on a mission.
Do you get angry if someone shoots at you? Because I would be angry if someone, even if it's from a surface to air.
No, it was kind of the game,
Okay.
just part of the process.
Okay.
And they would tell you in the briefings if you could expect flak, and we did. We had evasive maneuvers that we took. We had certain altitudes that we flew to try to avoid it. And it caused your adrenaline to pump, but other than that, it was just part of the mission.
Right. What's the so when you were over? What was the mission that you were going that you had to land in Da Nang? What happened?
We took a round through. I don't remember what it was, one round, but we took a hit on the airplane that ruptured a fuel cell.
Okay.
And we were leaking fuel. And we were leaking so much fuel that we could not make it back to the ship. So they rendezvoused us with a tanker. We plugged into the tanker, air-to-air refueling, and then we stayed plugged into the tanker until we got close enough to Da Nang where we could unplug from the tanker and still make it to the field and land.
That's amazing. Plugging into a tanker, you see that at movies. It looks like a pretty tough thing to do. Is that a hard thing to do?
It is kind of hard. However, we tanked on almost every single mission over there.
Okay.
So you got pretty adept at it.
Right, because they would only send you with enough fuel to kind of get over there, right? Because they wouldn't want you more weighed down shooting off of a carrier than you needed to be, correct?
Yeah, the way they did it with the fighters is the fighters would be light loaded by about 2,000 to 4,000 pounds of fuel, so that that's to counterbalance your bomb weight or your rocket weight or whatever. And they would launch you, and then right after launch on your climb out, you would go ahead and plug the tanker, refuel so that you had plenty of fuel to get over the beach, and then you'd come back, refuel again so that you had enough fuel to get back to the ship.
Wow, that's a lot of refueling. Does it? And so let's talk about what you were flying and what happened when, because you've got this amazing picture, and the wing of a plane it looks like you could see just a huge hole in it. Tell me about that.
That was flying through a field of flak. The airplane took one direct hit. The round went right through the right-hand wing. We call it in the Navy the starboard wing.
Okay.
And it went through the wing outside of the wing fold hinge. And it cut fuel lines and the hydraulic lines. We still had control of the airplane. We were going to have to make an emergency landing or eject. And what we attempted to do was get back to the ship, at least in the area of the ship, so that if we had to eject, the helo from the ship could pick us up. When we got in the vicinity of the ship, again, we had to plug a tanker, and while we were tanking, fuel was streaming out of that hole in the wing, but we were still able to retain enough to get back to the ship. Once we got back to the ship, then you drop your landing gear. We had to, because we had lost our hydraulics, we had to blow the landing gear down. There's an emergency procedure for that. Blow the flaps down, but the flaps only go to half when you do that. So that meant that our landing speed was going to be way too fast at the ship. And so we made one approach to see whether we could get aboard. We felt we could. So we made another approach. If we didn't make it on that approach, we were going to eject right after we went by the ship. However, we did trap, landed on the ship. The airplane was a total loss, and they actually pushed that airplane over the side.
Well, that was an F4? Was that real?
It was an F4.
Is it hard getting back in the cockpit after incidents like that?
I think it gives you more respect. I think the only time that it was a little bit hard for me to get back in a cockpit was when we had somebody shot down.
Okay.
I mean, coming back off of a mission where you'd been shot up, yeah, it scared you, and more so, you were just so glad that you made it back.
Right.
But when somebody else was shot down and they didn't come back, and that really brought it home. I mean, that really made you think about it, and I think it affected all of us the same way. There was a pallor that just did not exist at any other time.
How'd you work through that?
I don't know, you just did.
Yeah. Was it, when something like that happens, I imagine once you touch down and you know you're going to be safe, there's got to be a lot of adrenaline and exuberance, like almost victory.
Well, there is. And sometimes you would land and you'd go down and debrief the airplane, and you'd go in the locker room and start to take your gear off, and all of a sudden you'd realize that you're just shaking like a leaf. But it hadn't sunk in before that.
Right.
And then there's also sometimes you'd come back off a night mission. There might be weather in the area or a pitching deck, and your skills are not always the same, and you might have trouble getting aboard the ship. You might make 2 or 3 or 4 attempts before you get aboard. And sometimes after those things, it was the same thing. You'd get down in the ready room, start taking your gear off, and go, ooh, man.
Yeah. What year is this that you start over in Southeast Asia? What?
1965.
So that's just when we officially that's right after Gulf of Tonkin. We declare that we're going to send combat troops. So things are really, that's the escalation period.
The Gulf of Tonkin was in August. When I mentioned my second line mission, where we spent part of the time in the south and part of the time up north, that's what caused us to go north, was the Tonkin
resolution.
Yep.
Was that so Vietnam really started heating up then, and did the tenor or the flavor of the war or the atmosphere in Vietnam change with that, or did it just mean more fighting?
It did change. It was more like it was a real war, and now we're going to get with it, and now we're going to get this thing over with.
Right. I was watching, in fact, doing a little bit of research before this. In '65, there was really a sentiment that this was going to be a 2-month war, and we were going to go in there and just kind of walk all over and finish it up. And it's going to be a short war because they were no match for American military power. Did you think that this was going to be short, and then you were only going to be over there for a little bit, or did you think that you were in here, maybe over in Vietnam, for a longer duration?
Oh, I was convinced we were not going to be there very long.
Really?
I was convinced that we didn't think the MiGs were any match for the F-4 or like the F-105 Thunder Chief, and the Air Force also had F-4s. They were very primitive. I mean, really primitive. And so when we got there, we thought, we'll just nail them and it'll be over. The discouraging part was they started restricting our missions. The missions started being assigned from Washington. There were actually SAM sites that we identified that they didn't let us take out because they were not an assigned mission from Washington. I think by the time I was shot down, most of the crews were going, wait a minute, they can't continue like this. They've got to let, the boots on the ground and the people that are here have some authority on what the missions are and what you take out. Otherwise, how are you going to win?
Yeah, that must have been very frustrating.
It was. I got shot down before
Right.
the real big frustration started, I think. But
Yeah, let's talk about when were you shot down? Let's go back. Can you go back with me to when the date and what happened and what you remember?
I was on my final line period. We had gone to Japan for R&R, and it was in October, and we had about 3.5 weeks on the line, and then we were going to go home. We got back to the line about, seems like the 7th of October or something, and it was called Yankee Station, which was about 100 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. And
So it's almost 50 years ago today.
yep.
Okay.
And the particular mission that I was on was a flak suppression mission. It was the largest airstrike, and it was in the vicinity of Hanoi. It was on the Tai Nguyen Railroad Bridge, just to the north west of Hanoi. It was the main railroad link between Hanoi and China.
Okay.
It was a Sunday. We got up about 3 o'clock in the morning, went to CIC and briefed, manned the airplanes about daybreak, tanked on a tanker departing the ship. There were 4 F-4s from VF-84. There were 4 F-4s from our sister squadron, VF-41, and all the rest of the airplanes were bombers, A-4s and A-6s. There were 22 airplanes on the mission. Our assigned position was we were on the north side of the main force. We were armed with missiles and rockets. So we had an air-to-air mission of combat air patrol protecting the bombing force going in, and a flak support mission once we got there in case we saw any flak. Going into the mission, I was flying in number 2. Of the 4 airplanes, the lead is number 1. Number 2 is the next airplane. Number 3 and 4 are another section. The number 3 airplane, which was the section leader of the second section, on the way into the target, took a round through the cockpit. The pilot was killed, and they crashed into a karst ridge. At the time, I thought both guys had been killed. As it turned out, when I got shot down later on and got to Hanoi, the backseater of that airplane had gotten out and was a prisoner. Anyway, we made it to the railroad yard. Didn't encounter any flak right at the railroad yard until the first airplanes passed over. And once that happened, then the whole sky lit up with flak. We picked out a gun and made a run on that gun, and actually fired our rockets at it, took that gun out, and lifted off, departed with the rest of the bombing group, heading back towards the ship. We got separated from the bombing group, so we were kind of by ourselves. We were egressing as fast as we could go. That was the briefed way to do it. Go as fast as you can go and as low as you can go. So we were flying so low that we were at treetop level much of the time. And when we'd come up to a karst ridge, we would roll over on our back and pull down over the crest in order to stay down low.
Wow.
We came over one of the ridges. There were gun emplacements on either side, and they triangulized us. We knew that they were shooting at us. We could see the rounds. It looked like a flaming tennis ball.
Okay.
It was just a round, white on the front edge, had a little flame tapered off of the back of it. I mean, I can see it as if it was yesterday. And they were so close to us that you could see them clearly. We broke to the right, pulled the nose up, broke back to the left and down, and then we're just rolling through that to bring our nose back up again when we took about somewhere from 3 to 5 hits. They just walked them down the side of the airplane. Again, it was not like in the movies. You know, in the movies, a big explosion and background music and shaking and shuddering. And, well, all it was the way I describe it is if you take a drinking glass, a water tumbler, and stretch a piece of tin foil over it and poke holes in it with a pencil, that's what it sounded like. It sounded like they were poking holes in the airplane with a pencil. However, we immediately had an internal explosion. We had a fire start. The tail light panels on the dashboard all started blinking and lighting up. Fire warning lights. We were going 575 knots, and we were probably at 200 to 300 feet above the ground.
Wow.
So we were screaming.
Right. And you weren't very high either.
No. And the pilot I was with was Ralph Gaither. Ralph Gaither said, we'll try to make it to the water. So I keyed the mic. I said, this is yellow 2. We've been hit multiple times. We're going to try to make it to the water. And when I let off of the mic button, we got hit again. And when we got hit again, Ralph says, I got fire warning lights in both engines. I've lost the starboard engine. We're losing the port engine. Eject, eject, eject. And I reached up and eject. I don't know what airspeed we were going when I ejected. The last I saw was 575 true airspeed. Limit on the seat is 350 to 400 knots. So ejecting going that fast, you're probably going to get killed or busted up badly. Plus we were at very low altitude. I remember when I pulled the face curtain, it came all the way down to the stops right here, and it went through my mind, holy, this thing's not going to work.
Right.
Because in that split second, that's the way my brain worked. But then canopy came off, and I remember the whole ejection sequence almost like it was in slow motion. The canopy came off, I feel the horrendous jet blast, the explosion of the shell that drives the seat up the rails, and I remember that explosion, the seat going up the rails, and then it was like I got hit by a freight train.
Really?
It was like I was slammed into a wall. And my helmet rotated down over my eyes, my oxygen mask went underneath my chin, my left leg wrapped around the side of the seat, and my parachute opened instantly. I remember they teach you, look up at, make sure your shroud lines are okay. Look up at your shroud lines, then look out at the horizon and flex your knees. And I remembered all that. When I looked up at the parachute, I got hung up a little bit because panels were just blowing out of the parachute was orange and white. And some of those panels were just tearing out of it. And I knew that wasn't good. I didn't have much time to think about it. And then I could hear them shooting at me. And I saw bullet holes going into those panels. And I went, and I did get mad then.
Right.
because they're not supposed to shoot at you in a parachute. But I didn't have much time to think about that either. I estimate I was in the parachute about 11 seconds before I hit the ground.
Longest 11 seconds of your life?
Well, I don't know. It all went pretty fast.
Okay.
I do remember reaching over here to grab my radio to get it out so I can make a call, and I realized I don't have time to do that. When I was grabbing for the radio, I saw the airplane crash right out in front of me, and I saw Ralph's parachute open, and he was straight out in front of his parachute. His parachute was like this. He was straight out in front of it, and he hit the ground. He just hit the ground skidding like that. He never ever got upright in his parachute. And then I realized I was going to hit the ground, and I just felt like I was going way, way too fast. I didn't feel like the parachute was slowing me down. I hit the ground really hard. Both my knees came up and hit along either side of my chin. I immediately released my parachute. I tried to stand up, and I was having trouble standing up. There were V all around. They were shooting. You could hear them yelling. I got my helmet back off where I could see. Had trouble getting my oxygen mask off. You have to get your oxygen mask off so you can get the helmet off. And once I got that off and the parachute disconnected, then the V were all coming over the crest of the hill and everything that way. So I took off and ran this way, down a little slope, big long grass, some bushes. And when I ran over that little slope, there was a dry creek bed. So I ran into that dry creek bed, ran up the creek bed until a sharp turn, and there was a whole bunch of underbrush growing over the creek bed. And I was now out of sight of the guys that were chasing me. So I hid in that brush, in that creek bed. And when I stopped, I was kind of in a sitting position, and I had one knee up, and I noticed that my knee was just, I was wearing a G suit, anti-G suit, and they have openings at your knees, and my left knee was just starting to grow out of that G suit. It was swelling up. The guys that were chasing me passed over me and did not see me. I actually stepped on the bank of the creek no more than a couple of feet from me, but they didn't see me. I stayed there for 10 minutes or so, and then they started backtracking and missed me again. And so I took time to get my survival kit out. I wanted to put some camouflage stuff on my face, and I wanted to get my radio out so that I could make a radio call. I discovered my radio pocket had been torn off, so I didn't have the radio. Other parts of my gear were all torn up, and I realized that it had just kind of shredded me when I came out. About that time, 3 peasants came walking down the creek bed, and you could tell they were tracking, and they were looking down and looking up and looking down. One of them had a muzzleloader rifle. One of them had a spear, and the other one was a woman, an old lady. They had these big conical shaped straw hats on, real baggy black pajamas. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, this is not real.
Right.
The people that had the guns that had been chasing me looked kind of like soldiers. They had pith helmets on. I didn't see them up close, but anyway, they got within about 35 feet or so of me, And the guy with the rifle all of a sudden brought it up and he pointed it right at me. And I went, I don't know whether he sees me. I don't know whether he suspects. He's just pointing at the bush. I'm very well camouflaged, but I wasn't sure. Anyway, he reaches up and he pulls the hammer back to cock it. And so I stuck my hands out of the branches and the twigs, and I stood up very slowly with my hands up like this. And when I did, one of those militia guys came running over the embankment right there and turned on me, and when he did, he had an AK-47 rifle, and he turned on me and he just hosed off a burst. The shells hit right in front of my boots and walked right up the dirt. I was in kind of like an embankment, and then he dropped down and was going to shoot again. So I was carrying a .38 revolver, which is a survival weapon in the Navy, and it's loaded with tracers so that if you're in the water and a helicopter comes to pick you up, you can shoot these tracers. The helicopter will be able to see you. So I got the pistol out, and a round went off as I was getting it out of the holster. I was scared. Yeah. I was panicked. So it's a wonder I didn't shoot myself in the leg trying to get the pistol out. I got the pistol out. I'm left-handed, so I switched it over to my left hand. I had dove back in this clump of bushes, and I laid my elbow on top of my knee, and this guy has now, the militia guy, has run towards me another 5 feet or so and then dropped down in a prone position, so he's laying down, and he's just bringing his rifle to bear again, and I shot him. And when I shot him, I realized I shot him with a tracer. I could see that. And it actually went through my mind that that's against international law. I hope I don't get in trouble for this.
Right.
Anyway, his head went flat down, and at the same time I got jumped over my right shoulder by somebody. I did not even see them, but I saw the cuff of a sleeve, and I saw the muzzle of a rifle, so I just took the pistol and fired it again, and that person fired at the same time I did, and I became unconscious. The next thing I knew, I'd already been captured. They already had me tied up, and there was a little kid running around with my .38 revolver looking in the barrel of it. And anyway, then I'd been captured.
Did you, I mean, that must have just been a horrifying, I can't imagine more horrifying. People are out looking for you, you're injured, you don't know, I mean, I just can't, you can't script something. That's Hollywood wouldn't script that. It's too unbelievable.
The horror and terrifying stuff hadn't sunk in yet.
Okay.
I'm still operating off of pure adrenaline.
Okay.
They stripped me of anything they could. I had a survival knife. They were using my survival knife to cut off my G-suit, to cut off my harness. They took my watch. And anyway, they finally get me standing up. They tied a rope around my neck, took the rope and ran it down through in between my legs so that I was on a leash, and they were pulling from behind, and any time that they wanted to stop me or move me, they jerked this rope up tight into my crotch. We went, and I can't see out of my right eye I can't see very well out of my left eye. I'm soaked in blood, and I've got blood dripping off of my face. And my left leg is now really screwed up. So as they're trying to get me to walk, I happen to see him bring Ralph. And Ralph has got a big, huge, bloody mess here on his neck. And they've got him tied up the same way as me. And they bring us close to each other. And one of the things I had noticed was I knew they had Ralph because I had his watch too. He had one of these big Rolex Explorer Submariner type watches.
Right.
And very unique to identify. Anyway, I said, "Hey Ralph, they really like that watch of yours." And he kind of snickered, and man, they lambasted us both for talking to each other. Then they separated us. I never saw Ralph again for 5 years.
Wow. So what'd they do? Where'd they take you?
They took us, kind of half drug us because we couldn't walk. Neither one of us could walk very well. We're out in the countryside in the middle of nowhere. There is a little trail, almost like a cow trail. And they did give us something to drink. We were scared to drink it. We thought they might be trying to poison us. Anyway, they took us to a grass hut. It did have bars in the window. I had kind of a bed pallet in it, and they put me in there, took my boots off, and had me lay down, and then they kept parading people by to come and look at me. And they were throwing stuff at me and spitting on me. And anyway, they kept me there until the Army came and picked us up. When the Army picked us up, they took us out of that. Ralph was in another hut nearby, I guess. And they took us into the kind of middle of these huts, and there was a pole, kind of like a fence post, except it was about that big around. And it had big iron horseshoe thing on the top of it. And they took me out there and they tied my wrists to this thing so that I was pretty much standing up with my wrists tied. And then they gathered all the villagers and militia, and the Army guy had a megaphone, and he gave some kind of a talk or rally or something. And then the crowd really got stirred up. People started charging at me with machetes and throwing rocks, big rocks, and one guy broke through the guards and got within maybe 3 or 4 feet of me with his machete. A guard took the butt of his rifle and smashed it into this guy's face to keep him away from me. They put me in a Jeep, in the back seat of a Jeep. They tied my wrists to the rails of the seat, drove me to an Army camp. I was interrogated at the Army camp. I gave my name, rank, serial number, date of birth, which is what you're supposed to do. They didn't have anybody that could speak English. They had a pointy-talkie book. They tried to get more information from me out of that. I wouldn't give them any. Then they loaded me in a 6x truck, an Army truck. They laid me face down, spread eagle in the bed of the truck, tied my wrists to the 2 front corners of the box, tied my ankles to the 2 back corners. I'm laying on these metal ribs that they slide cargo on in the bed of the truck, and then they drove to Hanoi with me laying that way. Well, by the time I you know, you're in an army truck and it's bouncing and the roads were not on paved roads or anything. By the time they got me to Hanoi, I was pretty much a basket case. My face had been beat to a pulp. I was just beaten horribly from laying in that truck. They untied me, tried to get me to get out of the truck. I couldn't. I mean, I couldn't stand up. I couldn't do anything. And still I haven't had this be scared yet. I'm just...
What are you thinking about when they're tying you, or when people are spitting at you, yelling at you in a language you don't understand with machetes? What goes through your head?
Most of what was going through my head at that point was, I got to figure out a way to get out of this.
Right.
I got to escape. I got to get away. To this day, I don't consciously remember thinking about how much I was hurting or what was going to happen next, or I just wasn't that far yet.
Okay.
Anyway, they drug me out of the truck by my ankles and just let me fall on the pavement. Well, a 6x box of a truck is that far off the ground. They just pulled me off and I fell face down on the ground. So, and then picked me up by my armpits and drug me in through this big archway, a little bit of a walkway, and then a door to the left. And they put me in there. The door was painted blue, I remember that. They put me in there and just threw me on the floor and then closed the door and locked it. There were bars in the door. There was a window that had shutters on it. There were bars in those windows. Inside this thing there was a table and a stool in front of the table, 3 chairs behind the table, and off to the right there was a blue curtain. They left me in there for a while, so I went over to see what was behind the blue curtain, and there was a desk in there and the length of time that they've left me right now is, they probably left me alone an hour or so. And during that time, I was looking for a bathroom. That's why I pulled that curtain aside, because I realized that I hadn't gone to the bathroom for a long time and I had to go to the bathroom. Well, there was a desk in there. I happened to pull a drawer, top drawer open, and there was a black book in there, had a pencil stuck in it. I flipped open the book and it was an interrogation book. I see Everett Alvarez's name in there. I see Bob Peel's name in there. I see Jeremiah Denton's name in there. He was off of my ship and had been shot down. And I thought, this is not good. I had to go to the bathroom anyway, so that's where I went, was on that book. And I figured maybe I could obliterate it.
Right.
Anyway, then a little bit later they came in. They made me sit on this stool. It was a 3-legged stool. The legs were not all the same length, so you were off balance. I was made to sit with my hands in my lap. I couldn't bend this leg anymore. It was all swollen up and stuck straight out. And they started interrogating me.
In English?
Partially in English. There were 3 people. Partially in English and partially with this pointy talkie book. Their English was terrible. And of course their knowledge and what they were trying to ask me was idiotic. It was, I thought, well, this is like the peasants trying to interrogate me. They don't know anything militarily.
Okay.
Anyway, they asked me my name, my rank, my serial number, and my date of birth.
Okay.
At that point, I answered those questions, and then they wanted to know what ship I was from. I told them I couldn't answer that. long story short, because I know we're limited for time,
We've got as much time as you want to give.
I refuse to answer any question except name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. He hollered and yelled at me, he made all kinds of threats, and then he left. I was left in there another hour, and then another 2 different people came back, plus the same interrogator. He went through the same routine. I still refused to answer any questions. He advised me I would be beaten, I could be shot, that I was a criminal. I was not a prisoner of war. I was a war criminal. And then they left me again. This kept going on, and pretty soon they switched interrogators. He was a good guy. He says, "How are you? Oh, I see that you're injured. I should get you some medical care." And then he would start asking questions.
So it's good cop, bad cop?
Yep.
Okay.
This continued until about 2 o'clock in the morning. I arrived there about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
I'm guessing. This interrogation continued until about 2 o'clock in the morning. They got nowhere. They took me to a cell. In the cell there was a concrete slab on either side. In the nearest part there were leg irons that were built into the cell. It was a bar that dropped over 2 ankle holes so they could put your ankles in this, bring the bar down and lock it shut. It was horrendously filthy. There was a bucket at the far end of the cell. There was feces wiped on the walls. There was a window way up high in the far end of the cell, maybe 12 feet up. The height of the cell was probably 14 feet or so. They put me in there and left. They came back in a short period of time and gave me a blanket, kind of a blanket, and a bowl of soup and a crust of bread. The crust of bread was moldy. The mold was so bad that it was, like this paper paste glue that you used to have as a kid in grade school. The soup was just green water. It was in a what do you call the bowls that have porcelain on them and they're metal underneath?
Oh, yeah.
And it was all chipped and rusty, and I didn't think I needed to eat any of that. Anyway, I finally tried to go to sleep. So I took this old blanket type thing, laid it on the leg stocks, and leaned my head up against that and tried to go to sleep. And now I started to realize how much I was hurting. And I was really hurting. I realized, I put my hand up here, I was blind in my right eye. I could see some things out of my left eye, but out of my right eye I couldn't see anything at all. I noticed my leg was really, really swollen. I had this blood all over me. I felt around my face and I had caked blood all over my face. I couldn't really find a wound, and then I finally found it up here above my eye. I noticed a lot of pain in that area. Anyway, I tried to go to sleep. I didn't eat the soup, I didn't eat the bread. I tried to go to sleep. I dozed off and I woke up and there was a rat in my cell. The biggest rat I've ever seen in my life. Total length was probably this long. He had a body that was bigger than a rabbit, and ugliest looking rat I'd ever seen. And he was chewing on the calluses. They had taken my boots and my socks, so I was barefooted. And this rat was chewing on the calluses on my feet. Well, my immediate reaction was to kick him or launch or get my feet away from him, but I was afraid he'd bite me in the process. So that was the first thing that I really registered total fear with. And of course, as soon as I moved, he took off.
Right.
So the rest of the night, the rat and I were having a fight because he kept coming in the cell, kept trying to get at my feet. He was getting at the food that I had in there, so I took the food and poured it in a bucket, which was a toilet bucket. Anyway, I got no sleep that night at all. Mosquitoes were horrible. The mosquitoes were eating me. The rats were in there. Anyway, it was not a comfortable time. The next morning, they come in and they've got another bowl of soup and a piece of bread. And the guy is dressed like a doctor. He's got a white cap on. He's got a white face mask on, a white smock. And he's got a piece of paper and a fountain pen. He tries to give that to me. I tell him I don't want it. He speaks no English. As he tried to give it to me again, he tried to show it to me, and I could see that there were questions on it written in script in English. What is your name? What is your rank? What is your serial number? What is your squadron? What is your ship? What is your mission? There were 11 of them. And he's trying to force me to take this piece of paper and the pen. In my Marine Corps training in boot camp, they had code of conduct posters all over the place. And I remember one of those posters. I remembered it then, and I still remember it today. And it was, if you were taken a prisoner of war, you will always attempt to escape and you won't cooperate, and words to that effect. And there was a Marine there that was a prisoner, and there was a bayonet stuck through a piece of paper. So finally, when this guy wouldn't take a no for an answer, I finally took the piece of paper, took his fountain pen and stabbed it through the piece of paper and threw it across the cell. I did that rather impulsively. I did it knowingly that that was not going to be highly thought of, but my thought was, in the Marine Corps they taught you if you're tough enough, long enough, they'll leave you alone. And that was kind of my idea. The guy didn't hesitate an instant. He just launched out of the cell, just screaming at the top of his lungs. Didn't even swing the cell door shut. Just took off running. Well, the rest of the guards must have been right outside the cell, and they all came filing in, and I was immediately bound up. They tied ropes to my arms above my elbows and pulled them together behind my back. They tied them so tight that they cut off the circulation. Then they tied my wrists together. They even tied my thumbs together somehow. I couldn't tell how. I couldn't see back there. And then they laid me on my stomach and put me in the leg stocks. And they slammed the leg stocks shut. Well, those leg stocks are made for Vietnamese with ankles about that big around. So when they slammed them shut, they didn't fit. They were too small. They immediately pinched the skin, metal on bone, so it was very painful. And then they left me like that. A few minutes later, an interrogator came in. The interrogator started saying, "You have insulted the Vietnamese people. We give you food and you throw your food away. You must apologize to the Vietnamese people." And I didn't say anything, and I laid there. I'm laying on my face, and he says, "You will be punished." So they brought, there were, I don't know how many guards there were in there, maybe 5 or 6, maybe more. And they brought in a guy that had a bamboo club, and it was a piece of bamboo about this big around. He had a hold of it with both hands. And the interrogator would ask me a question. If I answered the question, fine. If I didn't answer the question, they hit me with the club. They asked me my name. I gave it to him. Rank, serial number, date of birth. Then he said, "What ship?" And I said, "I can't answer that question." And I'm laying there on my face, looking sideways. He's standing here kind of in my vision. And they hit me with the club. I didn't see it coming. I didn't know that was what was going to happen. And they hit me across the buttocks, the cheeks of my rear end. And he swung it like a full arcing swing of a sledgehammer. And it lifted my whole body right off of the concrete slab. And, you know, just automatically my body convulsed and this loud yelp comes out of my mouth. And he says, "Now you will answer the question." And I kind of took a breath and I didn't say anything. I just figured it was better not to say anything. He says, "What is your squadron? You must answer the question." I just didn't say anything. They hit me again. I can't tell you how long this went on. I can't tell you how many times they hit me. I got to a point that I was going to start crying. I was letting out screams. I was kind of losing control of everything. And so I turned my face to the right, which was towards the wall. And when I turned my face to the right, just as I got it turned, he hit me again. And when he hit me, I could see that it was just sending a spray of blood across the wall. I went, "Oh, that's mine." And I didn't want him to see me crying, and I didn't want him to think like they were winning, so I just kept my head towards the wall, closed my eyes, and hoped for the best. After they continued to beat me, I finally I lost control to the point where I started screaming. And it uncontrollable. I didn't have any control over it. I couldn't stop. I was like a baby does when a baby goes. I couldn't get control of myself. So they left. After a certain period of time, I don't know how long, I realized that it was not my buttocks that were hurting so bad. it was my arms and my chest cavity. They had my arms pulled so tight that it was cutting off all circulation, and it was pulling my shoulders and my rib cage apart. And I hadn't noticed that until then. And so I tried to roll over on my side a little bit to get pressure on this arm so that it would hopefully get some slack in the rope. It didn't work. And pretty soon I'm screaming all over again because of that pain. And I tried to see my hands, and I couldn't see my hands, but I could see about this much of these two fingers over my side. And it was like a surgeon's glove. If you take that glove and blow it up like a balloon, that's what it looked like. I mean, my fingers looked like they must have been about that big around. Anyway, when I started screaming again, they came back in the cell. The interrogator instructed the guard to loosen the ropes that were tying my elbows together, which he did. He probably gave me that much. Did not loosen the ropes on my wrist or anything. So the pain was all still there. It was just I had a little bit more. And they left me like that. 5 days, I got no food, no water, and they would periodically come in and beat me. And all they wanted me to do was admit guilt to the Vietnamese people that I was a criminal and apologize to the Vietnamese people. They weren't asking any military questions anymore. They just, in my opinion, they just wanted to break me. At one point, I finally said that I would talk to them when I feel I couldn't stand it anymore. So they took me to an interrogation. When they took me off of they at one point at the end of the first day came in and took me off my stomach and put me in a sitting position and relocked my legs in the stocks in a sitting position. So after this period of time, when they took me out of there to take me to interrogation, my buttocks had scabbed over, or at least the blood had dried into this big pancake, and my flight suit was embedded in that pancake. So when I got off of the bench, when they pulled me off of the bench, I couldn't stand up because I was glued into my flight suit at my rear end. They took me to interrogation. He set a clock in front of me on the table, and he told me that I had 5 minutes to start answering questions. They had taken the ropes off of my wrists and my arms. My arms were hanging helpless. My wrists, I could not get my wrists to come up or my hands to come up. And I told him I wasn't going to answer the question. He says, you must. You have 5 minutes. And he pushed the clock right over into my face. So I took my arm and I just raised my arm up and I, with the back of it, knocked the clock over. And then got up and tried to walk out of the cell. And I'm not doing a very good job. Or out of the interrogation room. Then I was trying to walk back towards the cell. The interrogator was screaming and yelling at the guard. The guard was a couple paces behind me, and just outside my cell they had a water tank, an old, kind of like a rusty bucket, but it had a dipper in it, half a coconut shell with a handle strapped on it, and we had a little water pitcher in our cells, and that's what they would fill it from, is that jug outside. So I hadn't had any water in all this time, and I tried to get a hold of that coconut shell and get some water to my face. Turns out they had just filled it. That water was hot. I did get some on my face, but I didn't get hardly any in my mouth before the guard threw a body block into me and knocked me into my cell. And again, 5 or 6 guards came back. They picked me up bodily and put me in the face down position in the leg stocks again, tied me up in the ropes, tied a rope to the rope that was tying my elbows together, and there was a hook, like a log chain hook, in the top of my cell. And they flipped the rope up over that, and then they lifted me off of the pallet that I was on by my elbows, by the ropes that were in my elbows and my ankles in the stocks, and they lifted me up to the point where either my nose or my forehead would touch. That was the only way I could support any part of my body. So in reality, I couldn't support my body. It was pulling my shoulders out of the sockets because the ankle was pulling my elbows back up towards the back of my head. My rib cage was separating. You could hear the cartilage in it actually tearing. I could feel my shoulders tearing and giving away. I don't know how long I stood that. I passed out at least once. But anyway, I started screaming again. To the point where you lose control, and I kept praying that I would pass out. I prayed that I would die. I needed some relief from that, and it wasn't coming. So I started screaming, and I said, okay, I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you. They took me back to interrogation, and I started answering their questions, but I didn't answer them truthfully. He wanted to know what ship I was from. And he says, I happen to know what ship it is. All you need to do is confirm it. You were from the USS Independence. I said, okay. And I said, but I was not stationed aboard there. I was just visiting that ship. He says, your squadron was 84. And I said, yes, but I'm not an air crew. And he says, what was your job? And I said, well, the man that was supposed to be in that airplane was sick, so they put me in there and I was supposed to watch for Vietnamese MiGs. Oh, how far away can you see a MiG? And I said, I don't know. I never saw one. He says, well, you are trained. How far away can you see a MiG? I said, I don't know. You must give me an answer. I said, 100 miles? No, not that far. I said, 50 feet? No, that's too close. I finally gave him some kind of an answer that he accepted.
Okay.
What is your job on the ship if you don't fly in the airplane? I said, I'm the swimming pool officer. He said, what does a swimming pool officer do? I says, in the middle of the carrier deck, we have a swimming pool. And the swimming pool officer has to keep that swimming pool full of water so that the crew can bathe in it. And we also get crucibles of water out of that and set it on the flight deck in the sun so that we can have salt to put on our meals. They're writing all this stuff down. Where do you live? I live in Montana. Where do you live in Montana? Farm District 1. What is your address? Number 1. What is the city called? Farm District number 1. Where did you go to school? At Farm District number 1 school. Did you have a job? Yes, I had a job. What was your job? I fed peanuts to ball players at basketball games.
And they're taking all of this down.
They're writing all of it down.
Okay.
And this was my first interrogation that I answered any questions. And of course, one of the things they say is you have to be careful because you'll forget what you told them and they'll use that against you. Well, I had a different theory. My theory was if I forget it and they use that against me, then I'm going to just tell them that I lied and that they can't trust me. And that's what I did. I never did give them any information at interrogations that was truthful. Never, ever. They did figure out that I was lying, and I said, I was lying. You can't trust me. And they never did trust me. That doesn't mean they didn't interrogate me or torture me or punish me to get me to answer questions, and that's the way I went through my whole life there.
Just lying and making up stories and telling them. But you were at least, is it ironic at all that you are telling the truth insofar as you're telling that you're lying and you can't trust me? I mean, that's kind of the one thing they could take to the bank with that.
Yep.
So
even, after 5 years after Ho Chi Minh died, I lived in 16 different cells. To capsulize this, I lived in 16 different cells. I lived the first 6.5 months in solitary confinement, where I never had another prisoner to speak to or to see or anything. I learned the tap code so I could tap 2 other prisoners. After that 6 months, I was moved into a cell with 1 other prisoner. He was a Marine captain. He and I got along very well, and we thought somewhat alike. He and I went through some horrible times together. We were so recalcitrant that the Vietnamese split us up after a year and moved us in with, each in with 2 other prisoners who were less resistive than we were. I lived with those 2 guys about a year, then lived in a cell with 8 guys. Then the Sante raid happened, and they moved us to the big cells in Hanoi where there were about 55 people or so in a cell. After about 5 years, Ho Chi Minh died, and they started allowing most of us to write a letter home. You were allowed to write on a sheet of paper that had 5 lines on it, and you would write a rough draft, send it in, they would censor it, and then you were allowed to copy from that censorship your final draft, and they would mail it home. I did not put my parents' correct name on it. I did not put the correct city or address on it, and figured, hey, if something comes from Rod Knutson from Vietnam, somebody's going to figure out where it goes.
Yeah.
And they did. So even when I wrote letters,
You weren't truthful.
I wasn't truthful.
So what did you say in 5 lines?
The first one I got to write, I think, was in July. And I said, my health, I wish I had it handy, but I don't. I can't remember, but something like, my health is okay. Please say hi to Aunt Margaret for me. And I hope to make it home for Christmas because you know how much I love thighs and breasts. My idea was to do something tongue-in-cheek so that Mom and Dad would know I had a sense of humor and I was okay.
Right.
And it didn't work all that well because they didn't see humor in any of it. But anyway, that did make it home.
Okay. So was all of these, does it follow the same pattern for 6 years where they just have you in cells and it's this never-ending interrogation?
There would be cycles. We called them purges. Sometimes they would give up on you for a while and your life would be nothingness for a long period of time. There were no windows in the cells, no reading material, no outside input except tapping on the wall to another prisoner. So you had no news, pure boredom. You were fed extremely poorly. Guys were barely skin and bones. You had diarrhea a lot. You didn't have good sanitary conditions, and you had nothing to think about. It was, every day was 365 days long. Every day. The first 6 months was, the first day after I was captured and in a cell was the hardest. The first week was the hardest. The first month was the hardest. And then the first year was the hardest. And then after that, it was just boredom. I mean, there were periods of terror and stress and beatings, and then there were periods of nothingness, where just every day had millions of hours in it, and there was nothing to think about, nothing to do but daydream. You know, I went through every kid in every class that I could think of and tried to remember their first and last names. I tried to remember all my teachers' names, and I tried to remember what teacher I had for what class. I tried to put together all of the states in alphabetical order. And then I tried to put the capital of each state with that state. You had no dictionary, you had no reference material. You got to a point where you relied on crutches for memorizing things. I memorized every POW's name that I heard in the system, either that I saw or heard about or anything. We got to a point where, you know, I don't remember what the maximum number was on my list anymore, but pushing the high 300s. And I had it where I would, every morning and every night, I would go through this list. Because I figured if I ever escaped or I got out, I could bring that list home, because obviously the United States didn't know who was over there. And each man belonged on a particular finger. If I got to this finger and I knew I had Baldock on this finger, and I had Alvarez on this finger, there's got to be somebody in between there, and I'd finally remember it again. And so you'd get to the point where doing that every single day, twice a day, you'd go to bed at night and you'd go dum 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 dum, and you just go through them all and then go to sleep.
What were your dreams about when you were in there?
I had one frequently occurring dream that was I was on the face of a cliff and I was standing on a ledge, and the ledge only extended out to about the arches of my feet. The ball of my feet was not on the ledge, and my hands were against the side, and I was balanced and I could stay there, and all of a sudden I would just start losing my balance and going forward, and I'd fall off the cliff. I had that hundreds of times. I had dreams of shooting somebody, which probably was caused by the shootout when I was captured. But there was never a person. I never saw a person that I shot. It was just that in my dream I was shooting a person, and I knew I had. But
Right.
and I would have dreams that I can't tell you what they were, but I'd wake up screaming.
Yeah.
Just
What was the food like? I mean, so the conditions were terrible, but how did you even eat enough or drink enough to stay alive?
if you're in a humid climate, things grow wild outside very easily. Weeds, grass, tall grass. Well, Vietnam is a humid climate, and they had weeds and grass and just crap that grew around the outside of our camp and stuff. They'd take a sickle or a scythe, and they'd go out there and they'd chop this down. They'd take it to the cookhouse. They'd throw these big bundles of grass and stuff in a pot, and they'd cook it and they'd bring that to us, and that would be our soup. The soup bowl was about this big around and about that tall. The soup was never served to us hot. Even if it was hot when it came to the cell, they would leave it sit outside on the floor until it was cold. And then in the beginning, they gave us a small crust of bread, which is like a French loaf that's about this long, that you take a knife and slice down the top so that it has this crusted part that sticks up. Looks pretty good. But when they would bring it, it was obviously garbage. It was full of weevils. It was so hard you could drive nails with it. But after a few days, I realized if that's all there is, that's what you got to eat. So later on, they would plant gardens with pumpkin or cabbage, and for periods of times like 6 or 8 weeks, that's all we'd have is this watery cabbage soup or this watery pumpkin soup. There was never any seasoning in it. There was no meat in it. Then they started serving us rice. You quickly learned that the rice was not very clean. It had rat droppings in it or small pebbles. Many a prisoner broke teeth while eating his rice. And for all the time that I was there, other than just little different levels of quantities and maybe a little pork rind once in a while, or a little fish mash once in a while, that was our diet. That was our staple.
For 5.5, 6 years.
7.5 years.
7.5, sorry. Is there, what's the TAP code? Tell me about that. I imagine it's a communication, right? But
Yes.
What's that? Tell me about that.
It is the way we had to teach somebody is that person is on the other side of a wall.
Okay.
So you can't draw him a picture.
Right.
You can try to draw him a mental picture, and I'll do that for you.
Okay.
You take the alphabet and you want to fit it into a 5 by 5 square that looks like a 5 by 5 tic-tac-toe.
Okay.
So there are 5 columns and 5 rows. The first letter goes in the first column of the first row,
Okay.
A. And then just fill out the rest of that row.
Okay.
B, C, D, E. Well, we know there are 26 letters in the alphabet, so we're going to throw one letter out. And that letter is Q. No, that letter is K. Boy, my memory's failing. That letter is K.
Okay.
So when we fill out the rest of the square, just skip the letter K, and you will end up with Z in the bottom right-hand corner.
Okay, got it.
Okay. All right, now just having told you that much, I'm going to tap out a letter, and I'll bet you can tell me what it is.
Okay.
When you tap, you identify the row, pardon me, the column and the row and the column. You identify the row first and the column second.
Okay. C.
That's right. C.
Thank you for not going 2 or 3 rows deep.
But very quickly you would be able to pick that up, especially if you're sitting in your cell by yourself, you have nothing else to do, you're going to rehearse this in your head until you've got it wired.
Okay.
The way we would call up a prisoner in order to keep a Vietnamese from answering us, we would always use the same call up, and it would be this.
Okay.
Commonly called a shave and a haircut.
Right.
And the answer to that is
Boom, boom.
2 bits. Okay, if you did a shave and a haircut on a wall and there was a Vietnamese on the other side, they wouldn't give you 2 bits. They'd give you some other thing and you'd know not to tap anymore. We were punished if we tapped on the walls. They would put you in handcuffs or leg irons or the ropes. But we got so that we could tap unbelievably fast, and we developed a language that is just like texting. You know, if we wanted to say good morning, it was GM. If it was good night, it was GN. Laugh out loud. Most any of those abbreviations you see in text, we had something similar to it. We also developed a visual alphabet, and I can teach it to you very quickly too.
Okay.
And you will remember it even when you leave here today.
Okay.
You may not remember all of them, but you'll remember a bunch of them.
Okay.
First letter in the alphabet,
A.
A. So it's A. B kind of looks like a B.
Okay.
C kind of looks like a C. D. If you forget this, I'll deck you.
Okay.
E. An E has 3 blades on it.
Right.
F has 2 blades on it. G is kind of a squared off
Okay.
C. H has 2 uprights on it. J has a hook on it.
Okay.
K,
Okay.
L has 1 bar sticking out. M stands on 3 points. N stands on 2 points. O looks like O. P for pinky.
Okay.
Q, nobody ever forgets that one. R, S, T, U, V, nobody forgets that one.
Right.
X,
Okay.
Y, and Z.
Okay.
So I can speak to you right now.
You. That's a W. No, it's an H. Okay. That's I. Is that I? Yep.
Hi, I just said hi. Or if you told me a joke, I could go like this.
H. Ha ha ha. So you would communicate like that with.
Sometimes cells would be arranged so that you might be able to see a crack or a little part of a window or something, and you could get your hand up there where they could see your fingers, and you could talk all day long.
Were you punished for trying to communicate with each other?
Absolutely. We were not allowed to talk to each other. Sometimes they even moved two guys in a cell and told you were not allowed to communicate to each other.
But you did anyway. Was it comforting to have another guy in the cell with you?
Yes. And my hesitation there is when two people live together 24 hours a day under extremely stressful conditions, they can work against each other.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something about the human nature that it's just hard. It really is hard. You have no other outlet. You have nobody else to talk to. You have nobody to settle the differences. So just two guys is hard.
Yeah.
Three guys is better.
Because you've got other people to.
Yep. And of course, then as the numbers get bigger, fine. But two guys is the hardest. There were a number of times people said over there, I'd rather be in solitary confinement than live with just one guy.
Was that true for you?
No.
Okay.
Harley Chapman was the guy that I lived with. Har and I got along pretty good. I mean, there were stressful times, and there were times that we were aggravated with each other. People have asked, well, did guys get into fights? No. I mean, they might get mad at each other sometimes, but no, there were no fights. People have said, have you got any stories that are so shameful you don't talk about them or you didn't bring them home? I don't. I mean, I genuinely, honestly don't. I never saw something that was so bad or so shameful that I wouldn't tell you about it.
Right. Did you think you were ever going to see home again?
I didn't know. I genuinely did not know. There were times I was convinced I would.
Okay.
There were times that I was convinced I wouldn't. But I always felt I'm going to give it my best shot.
Okay.
I said the first year was the hardest. By the time I was having the second and third and fourth and fifth year, it had become a life. It was just the hand that God dealt you, and that's the way you lived. It wasn't like horrible every day. You got up and you had your routine and you had your things that you did and the things you thought about, and you just lived. And
there was never any real external, you're never getting books, you're never getting anything, so it was all in your mind. For 7.5 years, you don't have anything to...
Yes, there's some exception to that. For instance, we would make ink. I showed you that brick of Hanoi. Mm-hmm. You could take a piece of brick like that, rub it on a concrete until you had powder, mix a little water with that powder, and have a very pale red ink. Our toilet paper was paper, but it wasn't paper. You could see slivers of wood in it. It was kind of the color of wood, and it had some paper-like quality. But we would and that was our toilet paper.
Yeah, most people don't describe their toilet paper as having a paper-like quality.
And it was horrible paper,
Right.
and it was pretty much useless as toilet paper. Anyway, we would take that and use it to write notes. So we would write notes to pass with information, or people made, if you were in a cell next to me and you knew Spanish, well, maybe I'd try to learn Spanish because it'll give me something to do. And I might make a dictionary list of Spanish words. Some guys wrote poetry. And before you leave today, I'll show you a poem that was written just like that. We actually made playing cards out of that. I mean, you couldn't hold them in your hand and deal them and shuffle them or anything, but we would make playing cards. But occasionally they gave us a newspaper, but it was a Vietnamese propaganda newspaper. Occasionally they played the radio over loudspeakers, but it was Vietnamese propaganda.
It was Hanoi, Hannah, and
Hanoi, Hannah, yep.
wow. So was it? Was even that kind of stimulation though? I mean, even though you probably knew it was propaganda, was it still something to?
We listened to it carefully, not for the propaganda, but to read between the lines. If they said they shot down 6 airplanes that day, we could figure they might have gotten 1 or 2.
Right.
That's the way I found out there was a man on the moon.
Okay. So they did tell you about that?
Nope.
No?
They said that the U.S. lied. The U.S. lied about saying that they could put a spaceship and a person on the moon.
And you knew that they had done it because why would you discredit a lie? Yeah.
Yep.
Was it, what did you miss? I mean, I imagine for 7.5 years, you have to take a different view of the life you had. That is, you probably looked on it, I would imagine, now I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what did you find yourself appreciating or thinking about in different ways that you might not have had before you became a prisoner of war?
Let me not just talk about me.
Okay.
I will talk about me,
Sure,
but I found that some people became very religious over there. Some did not. And it was, and all varying degrees in between. But the thing that all of us became was a believer that there's something more powerful than us. I mean, we're not alone in this world, even when we're alone. And you go into a recrimination mode where everything that you've ever done that you don't think was right or wasn't right, or if you'd ever broken the law, or if you'd ever committed some sin that you were ashamed of, all wells up inside you. And you go through this process of trying to cleanse yourself of that and making promises to yourself, you won't do it again. In my case, I didn't become overly religious, but I truly believe. I prayed a lot while I was over there, but not overly so. I swore that I would be a better person when I came home. I swore that I would not betray my family or my country or my teachers, and that I would come home with my shoulders square and my head held proud, and that no matter what they did to me and made me do that broke any of those rules, when I got home, I'd apologize for it, and I would admit it, and I wouldn't hide it. I said I would be a better father than I would have ever been. I would be a better husband than I would have ever been. I'd be a better son than I ever was. And I've tried to do that.
Yeah. I hate to say it, did the experience make you better? It's probably a dumb question for 7.5 years.
I often say, I never want to do it again.
Right.
And I wouldn't take $1 million for the experience. But yes, it made me a better person.
Okay.
Very definitely.
Okay, well, so let's talk about, so 7.5 years, you're in the same place ostensibly as someone like McCain, right? John McCain, was he part of the where you were at?
Yes, at times.
And so you're all there together. It's got to be kind of an odd camaraderie because there are people that you don't know, but you're all, I'm guessing, American there together.
We became almost a family.
Okay.
There was this inward thing, you didn't talk about it much, but you'd have given your life for any of those guys that were in there. Mm-hmm. When they would come in and take your cellmate out to torture him, they were torturing you at the same time. When he would come back beaten and incapable of taking care of himself, you took care of him, no matter what it was. Through his toiletries, through patching his wounds, no matter what it was, you took care of him. You became a family. And when people couldn't go on, or people started failing, you did it just like if he was your own child. You'd have been just as sincere about taking care of him.
That sounds like in the depth of an inhumane situation, there was plenty of humanity still left.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a lot of sense of humor there. We didn't lose our sense of humor.
Okay, well, what did you find funny? Give me an example, because it seems like I can believe that. I've been in some situations, nothing like what you've been, where there, I don't want to say gallows humor, but there was a lot of humor.
Well, it was kind of gallows humor.
Well, give me an example.
Well, I'll try to pick one that won't gross anybody out, but for instance, one day the guard came to my cell and he took me outside and he indicated to me that he wanted me to whitewash the cell, the outside of the cell. The doors were painted black and they were made out of metal and they had bars in them. They had a little trap door that they could see through, otherwise they were solid. The buildings were made out of brick. The walls were about 2.5 to 3 feet thick. And the outside of that brick was plastered or mortared, and it was whitewashed. So the guard told me that he wanted me to whitewash the walls. Well, we had a basic policy that we didn't do any work for the guards. If there was work to be done for ourselves, like if they wanted us to plant a garden and we raised that and that was our food, we would have done it. But to paint themselves, no, we're not going to do it. So you have to be careful saying no to a guard, because then they'll punish you or they'll torture you to get to do it just out of spite. So he showed me the bucket with the whitewash in it, and he showed me this straw broom that was tied together with bamboo, and you dip this straw broom in the bucket and then you paint the wall with it. So I said, okay. So I told him no, I wouldn't do it. He told me I had to do it or he gives you this. That means handcuffs.
Okay.
And so finally I took the brush, and instead of painting the wall, I just slopped it on the black door. And he just had a hemorrhage. And you need to wash it off right away. And he wanted me to wash it off. And he went and got a bucket of water. And this same bamboo broom. And he'd say the word watts, mean wash it off. So he set the bucket down right beside the paint bucket. So I said, oh, watts, okay, I'll wash it. Stick the brush and the whitewash again and start all over. Well, everybody in the cell was being quite entertained over this. The guard was not. And he took the lock off of the cell and indicated the lock was now had paint on it, and I have to get it off of there. He was telling me all this in Vietnamese. I couldn't understand any of it. So I took his lock, stuck it down in a whitewash. Anyway, I got fired. I didn't. We had a little game we used to play when I was living with Harley, the Marine. There was a siesta every day, and the guards would sometime, as guards do, sneak off in a corner, and they would take a siesta too. Well, when we noticed the guards had disappeared from, the way we would notice this is I would stand on top of Harley's shoulders, because there were these little brick-sized holes at the top of the walls in our cell. And I'd get on his shoulders, and then I would pull myself up by holding onto the ledge of this brick hole, and I could see out into the courtyard. And I'd look out there, and if the guards were not around, that means they're goofing off someplace. So I would yell through that hole, "Run, guard, run!" And I'd yell it about 3 times. And then I'd jump down off of Harley's shoulders, we'd lay down on our pallet and pretend like we were asleep. And you could hear the guards' shoes. They'd come out running, and they don't know where the sound came from. And they're walking around and they're opening every trapdoor of every cell and slamming it shut. Well, we thought that was a great game. So did all the rest of the camp. They didn't know who was doing it, that it was Harlan and I, but they were highly entertained that we would yell it and the guards would run and the guards wouldn't be able to find out who it was. Kind of a sad ending to that story, because I was up there chinning myself with my nose stuck in a hole. Guards were not around, and I yelled at the top of my lungs, "Run, guard, run," and our trap door popped open. And when the trap door popped open, Harlan was flat on his rack instantly, and I was hanging from the brick opening.
They caught you.
They caught us. And we got punished quite severely for that, but it was worth it.
So let's talk about 7.5 years. By that time, you're right, you'd made a life, because that's a long, long time in anybody's life. 2,673 days. Okay, 2,673. Tell me about the argument. Before we went on camera, I want one more story. The story of Spring. Just the arguments. That it's a good example of some of the things you get to talking about.
Well, one of the things I mentioned is that it's easier to live with 3 guys than it is 2, because 2 people have nobody to settle an argument, no third party to diffuse a situation. Well, I was living in a cell with 8 guys, and to give you an example of how things can materialize, Ed Davis was walking around the cell that morning and he said, "Happy spring." And I happened to, without even thinking about it, said, "No, it's not until tomorrow, because it's only the 20th of March. And he says, "No, it's today." I said, "No, it's tomorrow, because tomorrow's the 21st. He says, "It doesn't always have to be on the 21st. I said, "Well, I think it does." Anyway, we got into an argument over that. Argument went on all day. The other guys in the cells took sides, but we have no way of proving. We have no dictionary. We have just no way of sorting it out. So we finally made a wager. And I bet him a lifetime subscription to Playboy magazine that it was on the 21st. Well, I lost. When we got home, we sorted it out. It was not on the 21st. They no longer had that subscription available, so I gave him $500 instead.
What's the so how did the end come? How did you get released? Tell me about that.
The Paris peace accords were signed in Paris on, I believe, the 27th of January, 1973. Part of those accords was that all the POWs had to be told of that peace agreement within, I think it was 10 days or 2 weeks. And so they called us all together in a courtyard, let us all out of our cells at the same time. They had the courtyard lined with cameras. We came out kind of knowing that this must be what was going on. We had many other signs. They had moved, some of us were in a prison camp up by the border in China. They moved us back into Hanoi. Our food changed. They were fattening us up. So when they took us out into that courtyard, we kind of knew what was coming. And they announced that we were going to be released, and the first release would be within 14 days. Before we went out and got in the military formation, we had discussed that we would show no emotion in front of the Vietnamese camera. We'd give them no propaganda whatsoever, and that was part of our biggest fight while we were there, was not to give them propaganda. So when they made that announcement, they're all ready for us to start jumping and cheering and screaming and yelling, and we didn't do that. We just stood there. So it was a big downfall for them. I mean, they were very disappointed. So they read it to us again, like maybe we didn't understand. Anyway, then we all marched back in our cells, and after the cell doors were closed, in the privacy of being inside the cell, then we kind of went nuts, hugging each other and all that. But a better description is the day I was released. The day I was released, they dressed you in a uniform to release you in. We wanted our flight suits back. They wouldn't give them to us. They gave us a pair of black trousers, a pair of socks, a pair of black plastic type shoes, a sweater, and a little lightweight gray jacket, and a very small duffel bag. They loaded us into these little 12-man buses, all camouflaged, and they drove us through the badly bombed out sections of Hanoi, taking streets that went right by the bombed out sections, wounded and suffering people along the streets, I'm sure to demonstrate to us what we had done or what our country had done. Until we got to the airfield. At the airfield, we were put in a warehouse and waited for the airplanes to come. While we were in that warehouse, they gave us each a sandwich. It was on this French type bread, a little section about 4 inches long, and it had some pork type meat on it and a bottle of beer. When they were ready, they loaded us back in the little buses, took us out of the warehouse. When I came out of the warehouse, I saw the 141, the C-141 sitting on a runway. big red cross on the tail. I had never seen one before. They didn't have them when I was shot down. That airplane was shiny like a new dollar. I mean, it had been, the crews actually polished them. And it looked beautiful. We got on the bus. The bus stopped at this press conference arena type area, and there was hundreds of people around, lots of military, and thousands of press. We got off the bus and lined up in a military formation. I think I was the 13th guy in line, and we marched up to this table, and at the table there was a Air Force colonel in full uniform and a Vietnamese in full uniform, a Vietnamese soldier. When we got up to the table, the American read our name off on the list and looked up at us to see if that was us. And what we had said we would do is we'd salute and report our honorable return. So I walked up to the desk. I was standing at attention. I snapped a salute and I said, "My name is Lieutenant Junior Grade Rodney Allen Knutson, United States Navy, reporting my honorable return, sir." And I cut away my salute. The guy couldn't speak, the American colonel. Other than he said, "Welcome home." And Air Force Lieutenant Colonel stepped forward, took me by the elbow, and escorted me out to the airplane. It was about maybe 50 or 100 yards to walk out there. He tried to ask me a question, but he couldn't very well. He was all choked up. I was all choked up, so I couldn't answer his questions anyway. All I could think about was looking at the pretty airplane. We get to the back of the airplane, the ramp is down. We walked up the ramp, and I was shocked because when I walked up the ramp, the whole back of the airplane was floor-to-ceiling litters. And I hadn't realized that they probably thought many of us would not be able to walk. Anyway, I went past the litters. There were only, about a dozen people that had got on the airplane before me. Nobody sat down next to each other. They were all sitting in different seats. When I got on the airplane, there's a guy by the name of George McKnight that I know quite well, and I decided to sit beside him. And he was in the bulkhead seat. I was in the aisle type seat. There were only 2 seats. When I sat down, I kind of glanced over at his hands, and his knuckles were white, and he was holding on to the armrests. And I realized when I looked at my hands, I was doing the same thing. We didn't speak to each other. We didn't look at each other. We didn't look around. We just sat there and stared straight ahead. The airplane eventually got loaded. You could tell they were loading litters on the back. We didn't turn around and look back there. We just sat there. Then you could hear the whir of the hydraulics as the ramp came up. A Air Force captain, female, walked by to make sure everybody's seat belts were fastened. The engine started on the airplane started to taxi. Seemed like a long, long, long taxi. Finally, we could tell that we were pulling onto the runway and lining up. Captain put on the brakes, ran the engines up. got full power, and we knew what he was doing in the cockpit. He's cycling, he's controls, he's getting permission to take off, and we just sat there. Pretty soon he released the brakes, and the airplane kind of raised up and then went down, and as it was going over the seams in the concrete, it was kind of bouncing like this. Ka-thump, 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 as it went down the runway. Pretty soon he was at flying speed, started to rotate the nose, and clank, clunk, you could hear the gear, the landing gear came up, and when that clank, clunk happened and the landing gear came up, that airplane erupted. I mean, the guys in that airplane went absolutely nuts. They unstrapped from their seat belts, they jumped up, they were hugging each other, we were crying, we were yelling, we ran back to the guys that were in the litters, grab a hold of them. I mean, it was pure chaos. The crew was going crazy trying to get us to sit down and strap in. I mean, we're not 50 feet off the ground when we started that. Anyway, it didn't matter. And they never did get us back in our seats. They never did, not until landing. And they didn't know whether we could eat anything, so the only thing they had on board was these big coffee urn things, and they were full of some kind of high protein chocolate drink. And they offered that to us, and we got any beer? The Vietnamese at least gave us a beer when we left. We teased them a little bit. Anyway, they broke open their luggage, and if they had candy bars in there, we ate them. If they had lifesavers in there, we ate them. If they had chewing gum in there, we ate it. No matter what, we were just excited. They had cigarettes. I think we all smoked every cigarette that they had. Anyway, it was pretty exciting. And, you know, lots of it I can't even remember. I remember landing in the Philippines and looking out the window. I was not sitting in a window seat, but I looked out the window and I was shocked to see how many people there were there. I thought, it's a military base, they're just going to load us off in trucks or buses or something. But they had a red carpet set up. They had barriers set up, and behind the barriers were thousands of people. And you know the thing that shocked me the most was, of all those thousands of people, every little kid had an American flag. And I realized I hadn't seen a child for 7.5 years. And it was such a delight to see the little kids. Anyway, we got off the airplane one by one. They welcomed us home, put us on a bus, took us to the Clark Air Force Base Hospital. And on my elevator, and I think I was on the first elevator to go up, we didn't even get off the elevator until we took our clothes off. We didn't want any of that Vietnamese stuff to even enter the hospital. And so when we stepped off the hospital, we were naked. And they gave us hospital gowns and pajamas. And we went through a routine. They allowed us to take a shower. My first shower was an hour long.
Yeah, because you hadn't had a shower for about 7.5 years?
Nope. Pretty emotional. And the same at the hospital. They didn't have a bunch of food for us. They had these special diets because they didn't think we could eat it. And we said, no, you need to change your mind. And you can't order us. I'm not going to eat that stuff. You got to go get me a steak or something. Anyway, they did. They sent out and they got steaks and bread, and there are lots of funny stories about the first thing that people ate and how much of it they ate. But
for you? What's the first thing you ate, and how much of it did you eat? Thanks for walking into that.
The very first thing I wanted was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Really?
And that's what I had.
Okay. And did you eat a lot of it, or could you just do?
No, I wasn't one of the guys that did one of the crazy things.
Right. Did you get a beer finally?
We did, but not for about 28 hours or so.
Okay. And they kept you there for 3 days, correct? Were they just checking you over?
Well, you saw a chaplain.
Okay.
And the chaplain told you the things that he needed to tell you. Some people's families had died. Some people's wives had left them. Some people had even lost children. So the chaplains went through all that with you. Then you met with a paymaster. He told you about your pay. You had a complete physical. They fixed things as best they could for you. You had a Navy exchange or Air Force exchange run where you got to buy things. You went to a tailor and they made you a new uniform and tailored it all for you. So you had a uniform to wear home. You were allowed to call home. And depending how long you stayed there, you could call home multiple times. The first call for most people was, by and large, a non-communicative call. My first call was, my mother was staying in the War Bonnet Inn in Billings, surrounded by family and press people, and so the phone call came in there, and she couldn't talk to me and I couldn't talk to her, and we kind of stammered and stuttered for a while, and finally I said I'd call back in an hour and when I could talk, and so that's what we did. And
wow, that must have been amazing to hear her voice when you didn't know if you were ever going to hear it again.
It was, but it was like I talked to her the day before, other than...
Right. How was the last 7.5 years?
Yeah.
So then you got to come, did you get to come home then after 3.5 days?
What they did is they sent you to a hospital in the States.
Okay.
I had a sister that lived in San Jose, and there was no military hospital in Billings. So they allowed me to go to San Jose, and then they flew to Oakland, and then flew my parents out to Oakland. And when I arrived in Oakland, my parents were there.
Wow, was that neat seeing them?
It was.
Yeah.
And the airplane landed at Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco, and then you had about an hour and a half ambulance ride from there down to the hospital at Oak Knoll. And they had the prettiest nurse in the whole world that took care of me on the ride down there. When you got there, they had a public affairs officer enter the ambulance, and he asked if you wanted to meet your family outside at the press conference or inside privately. And I elected to meet him inside privately. And so we had a very short press conference and then went inside, and they were waiting for me in my hospital room.
Wow. My
mother and my dad and my brother and my sister.
What do you remember of that?
Very emotional time. Sure. My brother was extremely surprised that I was okay. He thought, he had it in his mind, no matter what anybody said, that I was going to come home a broken physical and mental mess. And so my brother was probably the most emotional of everybody because he was so elated that I was okay.
Right.
And then it was just pretty much a very private time.
Right.
We loved each other.
How do you now? You went. This is something that's amazing. You had a amazing welcome home, but you decided to keep on with a military career, and you weren't a broken mess. You attained some of the highest ranks in the Navy, and you go on for a very successful career. Why'd you do that, and how come? What drove all of that?
While I was a prisoner, and I was no different than anybody else, I did a lot of thinking about what I would do when I came home. And my decision was, if they let me go to pilot training, then I wanted to do that, and I may just make the military a career. I had liked my job before I was shot down. I liked the idea of it. I felt I was contributing to my country. It was not that I was overboard patriotic or anything, but I had a good feeling about it. I thought I was doing a good thing. So when I came home, that's kind of how I felt. Very shortly after I got home, the kind of the big thing, and it was bothering most of the POWs, was that we'd already heard that they might throw rotten eggs at us or tomatoes or something like that, but they didn't. I mean, we came home and they treated us as heroes. We didn't think that was right. Why do the other guys get treated like dirt and we get treated like heroes? We didn't do anything greater than they did. I mean, we were all just doing our jobs. One of the things that I decided right from the very beginning was that any of those veterans that I ever met, I was going to let them know that they were just like me. They weren't any different than me. And they deserved everything that I got. I didn't deserve it any more than they did. And I've tried to do that. And I've practiced that for 40 years, ever since I've been back home. I did get to go to pilot training. I did go back to an F-4 squadron as a pilot. I enjoyed my military career. I liked the people. I liked the kind of work that I did. I accepted the fact that it could be not pleasant if you have to go to combat. I also felt that if I have to go to combat again, I know why I'm going to combat this time. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind why I'm going to combat. And if they'd have let me go in Iraq, I'd have gone. And if they want me to go in this, take some of the old guys, send them over there, I'll go.
Right. Did you, so you got to was it hard getting back in the cockpit after having been shot down?
Not at all.
Did it feel good?
It felt good. Yep. I mean.
And let's talk, just because you had an amazing career, and I don't want to skip over that. You flew in the F-4s, and then you also flew Top Gun. You were one of the best that the Navy had, right? I mean, you flew in a number of different aircraft. What aircraft have you flown? And then you also helped out with when they did a little movie about Top Gun, correct?
Yes. I kind of flew the average number of airplanes for a fighter pilot guy. I think totally I flew 23 different airplanes, many of them in the training phase. I was a test pilot at China Lake Naval Weapons Center. I was a weapons test pilot, and I flew some different airplanes up there. I've flown 2 or 3 different models of the A4. I've flown in fighters. I've flown a fighterized version of the A4. I've flown the F4, the F-18, F-14, the F-15. I didn't really fly it much, but I got a FAM ride in it. Got a FAM ride in the F-105, but mostly F4s and A4s.
Okay. And what's your favorite? If you could fly any of those planes, which one do you like the most?
I have an affinity for the F4, I think. We call it the F-ugly. It was kind of an ugly airplane. It was brute force. I mean, it was noisy, it was heavy, it didn't turn as well as some of the fighters, threw out a big cloud of black smoke, but it was a fighter.
Right.
The A4 I very much enjoyed because it's like strapping on a sports car.
Right.
Single seat and lots of fun to fly.
Right.
I was fortunate in that through the right jobs and right circumstances, I kind of ended up in some of the elite part of the naval aviation world as far as Top Gun and the VF-126 Bandits go. We were an adversary squadron. I had top of the line pilots, just like Top Gun. They're the cream of the crop, some of the best fighters that you'll find.
Right. And you got to do, when they came to make this movie that they had a concept for Top Gun, you were one of the guys that they got to go up with?
When Washington gave the movie industry permission to make the movie, there are two people that they assigned as their cadre to kind of take care of them were the CEO of Top Gun, who at the time was Roy Cash, and me as the CEO of the Bandits. And because our airplanes flew such a critical mission with the Top Gun airplanes, we played a big part in the movie. Well, when the director and the head cameraman came to Miramar to see whether they could mount cameras on the airplanes in a manner in which they could make it interesting and actually film the fight, they wanted the same two pilots and the same two airplanes every time they flew in order to be able to calibrate all that. So Roy Cash flew the Top Gun airplane and I flew the Bandit airplane. And we flew mission after mission after mission while they arranged the cameras, remounted them in different places so that they got the photo effect that they wanted, the stableness that they wanted, and they could switch back and forth to different cameras. Because of that, also when they started making the movie, they asked for a group of volunteers, and of course most people were willing to volunteer. Roy Cash and I both said, as commanding officers, we were not going to volunteer, that we would stay out of it so that we could kind of play the role that we were supposed to play, which was commanding officer and monitor the whole process. However, once the movie was made and they got to the cutting room, they had so much footage of the Roy Cash airplane and my airplane that they started splicing that in to the point that one of the airplanes that flies in the movie is that same airplane that I flew all those calibration missions in.
Huh. That is, so looking back, one of the questions you have, we have gone different direction with your interview, mostly because of your experience. But one of the questions I ask I'm going to ask you two. One of the ones that I ask is, how do you now, looking back on Vietnam 50 years from now, do you see it differently, or how do you look at it now with the passage of time?
I would say that my attitude towards and my philosophy of success or defeat has been a sine wave curve.
Okay.
And it continues to be. I believe that when we first started out, that we had good intent. I believe that had it been a pure military battle, the outcome and the length and everything else would have been different. But it wasn't. It is what it is. I think that if you look at the aspect of whether we accomplished what we set out to do, we did not. Does that mean we lost the war? I have trouble saying we lost the war. I don't think we lost everything. I mean, there are many Vietnamese people, and including the fact that I think the country of Vietnam itself today is benefiting from that war. It's been a long road, and it's been different political directions, but I think today they are benefiting positively from the war rather than negatively. So maybe I'm thinking we're on the upside of the sine wave.
Yeah. Have you ever been back to Vietnam since?
I have not.
Do you have any desire to go?
I do not.
Okay.
Many of my friends and POW buddies have gone back, and they have enjoyed it. I don't have a desire. I don't have this, I positively won't,
Right.
but I just don't have any desire to it.
The other question I ask is, one of the reasons we're doing this, and one of the reasons I wanted to come here and have this conversation, and I appreciate it very much, more than you know, is to make sure that we save records of people who were over there and all the different experiences that they had. And you've had one that very few people did, probably thankfully, and I thank you for it. But what do you want people in the future to remember about Vietnam from a guy who was up close and spent years of his life over there?
I have no problem answering that question, and I have very strong feelings about it. The regime that ran Vietnam was the problem. It's not the people who are the problem. Time and again, I have met people, and they are no different than you and me. They had a government, the government ran their country, and they pledged to their government and followed their government through it. They suffered because of it, and there's nothing wrong with the people.
Yeah.
They are a different culture than we are, and that's fine. The thing I would stress is, if I had a message that went out to the whole world, to every person in the world, was participate in the formation and the running of your government so that it is what you want it to be.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate this, and I want to say thank you so much not only for your service, but also thank you for going and doing that, and thank you for serving 7.5 years of. It's listening to the stories. I was shocked at just how brutal, and yet how you tell them, and thinking I have nothing in my life experience that could even come close to comparing to what you've just shared. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for making that sacrifice, and thank you for spending your whole life in the service of this country. So, And thank you for inviting us into your home and sharing these stories. I really do appreciate that, Rod.
Thank you.
Thanks. This has been Vietnam Voices with Daryl Ehrlich. I've been with Rod Knutson.